Hello, this is Zara Richter. This is another episode of the Facing Autonomy podcast. We have a really exciting group today. Unfortunately, Violet didn't make it, but we have myself, Zara, and our recent new Facing Autonomy collective member, Flo, of the UK,
Hello.
who is joining us today, and we're going to interview Sasha Durakov, who he has created this amazing website. It's called unsoundmind.org, which it's a public resource for knowledge about psychiatric disability. It's what people might call in formal academia a digital humanities project, but it exists purely to offer really counter-institutional knowledge about the history of psychiatric disability and all kinds of aspects of it, which are really not well understood by the public or by academics in general. But before we get into it, let's have everyone introduce themselves. Flo, go ahead and say what your name is and tell us about yourself a little bit, and then we can hear from Sasha.
Okay, so yeah, my name's Flo. I'm a member of a union, the IWW, like Zara. I helped found a general membership branch a few years ago, and have been kind of interested in anti-psychiatry probably for the same amount of time, so about half a decade. I'm not a formal academic, so I'm probably at certain points maybe we'll ask people to define things in layman's terms for me at times. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I looked over the blog, as I said earlier, and have come up with a few questions relating to things I'm interested in. At the moment, I'd say I'm mostly influenced by more European style individualism. So Novator is a really good example, but I really enjoy Sidney Parker's writings and Emile Armand, stuff like that. So as time went by, I kind of honestly veered away from syndicalism and started to approach, I guess, as most people call it, a more egoist understanding of anarchism and how it relates to my own life and interests. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, my name's Sasha Durakov, or Sasha Warren, either one. Today I'm representing the Of Unsound Mind project at unsoundmind.org. It really started, if I could just give a brief intro to the project, it really started after the uprising where I am in Minneapolis over the summer. There was, I guess I was just inspired by the moment and felt a really strong desire to connect a lot of the thinking that I had been doing around psychiatry and medicalization and connecting it to this broad and powerful movement against police and prisons and this whole carceral society. Because I saw those issues as being really strongly connected, but I just didn't see those points being linked up at all anywhere, or at least not nearly as much as other conversations. So the site itself is sort of an archive, I suppose, is the best way to describe it, a digital archive, but it's a partisan archive. And it's also not associated with any sort of academic institution. It's not associated with any kind of nonprofit. It really is just a passion project that came up out of this moment of wanting to just put some of these arguments out there and put some of these resources that I've been checking out there. But lately it's grown into also a project that I'm thinking of more as a way to make, you might say, like paradigmatic or informational interventions into social movements, into different discourses, both medical and political, hoping to just join those together, I suppose, like to find ways to talk about movements that are happening, social movements that are happening in the medical field and in the psychiatric field, opposition that's taking place from patients themselves, and connect that to broader political questions and radical topics and questions. So I guess that's the best way I could describe it.
Right. That is really amazing what you're doing. I mistook it for being an academic project because I myself am a graduate student. For grad students in the current world, they're encouraging grad students to do what's called digital humanities projects, where we translate our research into a form where it can be, kind of looked at by everyday people using all of the interesting graphic design aspects of the web, such as like timelines. There's one thing they call digital humanities kind of thing.
Hmm.
So I do feel like I would have mistaken you for someone who's actually in maybe in a history master's program or something like that, because I specifically want to compliment you on how rigorous and thorough your history timeline on your website is. Untold
Yeah,
Minds
it's
timeline is
fantastic.
really, it is so detailed with so many things. I've never seen a timeline that was that radically inclined, but was that detailed. And so that's why I did, before we started to talk, I thought you might have actually been legitimately doing this as your graduate thesis or something, without knowing that you mentioned earlier that you're an academic. So, I want to commend you on the project. I mean, again, facing autonomy, I started this with someone else who didn't make it this morning, Sheer, and we started this around the same time as the George Floyd uprising, but partially because we had all this time when we were indoors and without interacting with anyone during the pandemic. So we decided to make this during that time, and it was something that was I was able to make, thankfully, because I had received a I had started work on this grant that I did last year called the Psychiatric Survivor Oral History Project, where I got a municipal Washington D.C. Non-public humanities nonprofit to give me $7,000 to interview people in the D.C. area about surviving psychiatry and doing patient organizing. And so I was lucky to get money to do that and to interview several people. And I will be at some point making a different website than Facing Autonomy, where I will put all those interviews publicly. But I had originally created this platform that we're using and paid for Zencaster in order to interview people digitally for that project. But then it turned out that because my funding was so location based, I couldn't interview people who were somewhere else other than DC anyway. So I didn't actually use this Zencaster program to interview anyone for the project, and I ended up just using this to create separate podcasts to express
Hmm.
my more directly political interests, which are more have in the last couple of years been kind of in the council communist or council syndicalist place. And I've gotten there through reading the Italian autonomous movement and through reading CLR James. We talk about that in other podcasts. But being in that position, I am united with various anarchist strands like that of Flow, and I think that anarchism and Marxism, there's a lot more role that mental health struggles have to play with anarchism and Marxism. And so that's why it was really exciting for me to bring other anarchist friends of mine on the show with you today, Sasha, because I think that your your history of mental health is much less scientific positivist than you get from a lot of histories of mental health in the United States that I've seen, and a lot of very clinical disability programs are more oriented toward thinking of these things as a history of scientific discoveries instead of recognizing that these are histories of struggle, which is exactly
Mm.
how your timeline places everything and figures out everything. So I'm curious if Sasha, have you been contacted by anyone who comes from a more clinical background, either via social media or elsewhere, who has commented on this website at all? I'm curious to hear if that's happened.
Yeah, definitely. I've also been doing this little presentation series lately that's on the history of, you could call it like the history of the relationship between both the relationship between radicals and reformist and revolutionary movements in psychiatry, but also the radical tendencies that exist within the field. So looking at people like Frantz Fanon and Franco Basaglia, a lot of these people both had connections with the broader radical movements in Europe and Algeria and all over the world. So anarchist communist movements that were happening, student uprising, workers movements. But they also came to their conclusions and developed their theories by engaging with those traditions as well. So there's kind of an unseen linkage there that I think is really interesting and could potentially create some rifts. And it's been really nice doing the series because a number of people who have identified themselves as mental health professionals of various sorts. I know that at least one psychiatrist has made a couple comments on the work and has been excited by it and said that, you know, I have a page on the website that's talking about the policing function of psychiatry, and he commented very positively on that, which was maybe a little bit surprising. But also a number of, I think it's more common that you would see people like psychiatric nurses and social workers join and start having discussions. And one of the interesting things about that too is I talked about this in my last presentation, but I really do feel like within the field, in the mental health field, psychiatric nurses and social workers, especially people who are lower paid and oftentimes from immigrant backgrounds, that there is almost like a floodgate of criticism that's just waiting to burst. And it just needs a little bit of a push. An example of this is maybe not from the presentation series, but I'm also I helped co-found the Hearing Voices Twin Cities, part of the Hearing Voices USA or Intervoice International. It's a movement of social movement that's sort of creating a different kind of social space for people who hear voices and have other extreme experiences, where they can define their own experience and they don't have to accept any particular model. So that's a social space that we've been running for 3 years now, I think. And we also at times get invited to go places and talk with people. And there was one day where we got invited to a local, one of the local long-term commitment centers. So this is where people go when a judge has committed them for a longer period of time. You know, usually we talk about psychiatric incarceration in terms of psychiatric wards in general hospitals and things like that, where it's oftentimes a 72-hour observation period. Sometimes it's extended for a little bit after that. But this is the kind of place where you get sent when you actually go to a mental health court or a commitment court, and the judge says you need to be here for 3 months or something like that, sometimes much longer than that. And this particular one is interesting because it's in the old asylum grounds in Anoka, Minnesota. So a lot of people think that the old asylums, we had the deinstitutionalization movement and they're just gone and disappeared. But in the 80s, many of them just changed their names to regional treatment centers, opened newer, maybe slightly fancier buildings, and they still run and commit people who stay there for long periods of time, maybe not quite as long as before. But I'm getting very sidetracked here. We were invited to this place to give a talk about our group, and we had a fairly small group of a number of patients and 2 psychiatric nurses. And I thought it was just a fascinating experience because the psychiatric nurses, when we first stepped into the room, they were warning us about, you have to sit 2 seats away from these people. They're liable to lash out at you at any time because they're, dangerous schizophrenics and all this stuff, kind of the typical stuff that you would hear. But by the time that we finished our presentation and we gave a pretty directed, strongly worded speech, you might say, critiquing psychiatric violence and coercion as methods. And the nurses, by the end of the talk, were engaging in this kind of critical discourse of being like, a lot of the things that we pathologize in here, I don't see as actually problematic, or I could see how it's a reaction to a certain situation, or I don't really know why we need to confine people in such and such way. So I feel like that experience for me really showed that there's a lot of people out there that are ready and willing to start having these conversations, but that this machine is just so large and powerful, and it offers so few opportunities for anything emancipatory or even just less violent and less carceral, that it just gets eaten up so quickly. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
it does. Flo, did you have any question to add to keep the discussion going?
Yeah, so I have a few questions based on, as I said, looking at your work on the webpage, but just I suppose to add to something I heard in the answer there is in the UK there's actually a framing of private institutions as a kind of like alternative community care. So recently, like not that long ago, there was a massive issue regarding abuse in these care homes. So for me, it's quite like, having been actually on the other side of this, not in any clinical practice. I've always found engagements with psychiatric services to be quite hostile. So it's just really interesting to me that you've gone into these spaces and talked to carers and workers about perhaps different approaches to people who are displaying distress. But I think what's really fascinating to me, and a topic that I find interesting in regards to this, is diagnostic criteria. So if I'm correct, you were talking about how the nurses themselves were talking about behavior that they didn't even view as problematic. I suppose what I was wondering is, how do we even create the framework of understanding for what is and isn't quote unquote mentally ill? I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that is one of the absolute thorniest topics in the history of psychiatry and anti-psychiatry and critical psychiatry and all of that. I mean, that's like, a lot of people would say that's almost like the crux of the psychiatrist's power, in the same way that the police officer has the discretionary power to define legal circumstances, legal situations, sort of on the go or on the spot. There's been lots of talk about how, psychiatrists are often asked to do the same thing. They're interpreting data, they're interpreting conversations, usually just verbal or behavioral things, and trying to find a way to fit it into one or another category based off of a number of things. So Kraepelin is probably the most influential of these people, and his system was to look for prognosis. So like, what's the outcome of such and such thing? What does a certain pattern of behaviors, a syndrome, where does it lead and where does it go? So that's one way of doing it. But there's been so many different proposals over the years of how do you essentially capture the diversity and the wildness and strangeness of human behavior in general into various categorical systems, nosological systems. That's like the central question of the psychiatric gaze. There's been a lot of amazing critiques of this over time. One of the most influential for me, the earliest ones that I saw, was not actually specifically about psychiatric diagnoses, but about categories of health and abnormality and pathology in general. And that's from Georges Canguilhem. It's a book called The Normal and the Pathological. He's a French thinker. He was a partisan, a communist partisan in World War II. He was the teacher of Michel Foucault for a certain time. I can't remember exactly when. But he, in the book, The Normal and the Pathological, he goes through all these different ways that people try to establish firm poles of normal and pathological, or normal and abnormal. And he just shows that they're all extremely problematic. There's no simple way to create a solid boundary between the normal and the not normal. So like, one, for instance, is like, he says lots of people want to say that a certain quantity of something makes something abnormal. But if you're going off of a quantitative approach to abnormality, you can, it seems quite arbitrary. Or you could, a certain extremity of behavior is also maybe a more abstract way to think of this problem of quantity, because behavior is not easily quantifiable. But what is an extremity? How do you establish what is an extreme form of a certain behavior and what is a normal range for that behavior? Like, I don't know, screaming could be an example. It's kind of an odd example, but what's the normal amount that someone is supposed to be screaming? That seems like a really tricky question to answer.
There are so many different inputs, right? So like, there could be 1,001 good reasons for someone to be screaming extremely loudly.
Right, exactly. But you have certain social scientists and psychiatric researchers who seriously sit down and try to do studies of trying to find the normal human range for any particular behavior. And of course, then you have the people who say, but it's all contextual, or it's all cultural, or it's all political, or it's all related to economic factors. You can critique it from virtually any angle. Lately, I've been inspired by because I think that conversation around diagnostics is essentially infinite, especially when looked at in a vacuum. I really don't feel attached to these approaches that try to either talk about diagnostics or critique diagnostics within a vacuum, as if you're going to find some method that's foolproof, that's going to work in every situation to either talk about diagnostics or critique them, or discount them. So I've been lately really inspired by an idea that Franco Basaglia in the democratic psychiatry movement in Italy put forth. He talked about this idea of suspending the diagnosis, suspending judgment. This was an idea he got from Husserl, the phenomenologist, where he's essentially like, we can problematize this into the infinite, but what's that really going to do for this person in this real situation who has these real struggles going on right now? So what we're going to do is suspend the diagnosis. We're not going to make a judgment on it. We're not going to make a judgment about any particular diagnosis. What we're going to do is focus on the person, the way that they narrativize their life, and the concerns that they voice to us. I find that to be a really practical, simple, and useful way of approaching that problem.
So kind of like a situational approach to diagnosis. Am I
For
getting that
sure.
right?
Well, not exactly, because there are situational diagnostics. There are there's this approach now that talks about the biopsychosocial approach, and what we need to do is have a kind of sensitive, holistic form of diagnostics where we can get to a diagnosis that takes into account someone's family situation or their financial situation. I still think that that's extremely problematic because these aren't just factors, right? Like how much your position as a worker or your position in your life in relation to your family, or being gay or being trans or being any number of things, are not factors in your life. They are your life. But the way that the psychiatric professionals often talk about it is they reduce these enormously complex topics like, rent security or something like that, your housing security, something that's really related to a number of historical factors that brought you to that point and is extremely complex. And they'll just tick it off as a social factor. This is a way of reducing the complexity of life and often depoliticizing it. And they have no plan for anything to do with it. That's the thing, is they'll mark it off as a factor, but it's just something that they are like, okay, we're going to think about you still as being schizophrenic, but now we sort of have maybe a little bit more empathy towards your position and some of your behaviors because we see that you can't pay your rent on time, or because you have a difficult relationship with your parents. I think that that's still not the right way to go. You're still freezing the person and reducing them to a diagnosis. You're just sort of falsely complexifying the situation by including these flattened,
static kind of.
Yeah, these static things as factors when they're really not static or hypothesized at all, or they shouldn't be, I don't think.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah, that was.
If I may, I'll add something to continue the discussion. I think what you're drawing from Basagli is a brilliant move. I've been in my own experience, I have my own growth as a scholar has followed this trajectory where I started grad school and I was this sectarian member of the autistic activist movement, and I was part of that movement. I got this master's in disability studies, which was thoroughly involved in the disability rights side of the nonprofit industrial complex, and I found myself within that environment slowly growing frustrated with both the autistic version of the nonprofit industrial complex, which was growing around me, and the disability rights world, which was doing a lot of the things you're talking about, Sasha, when you talk about people kind of philosophizing about diagnosis in a vacuum. You know what I'm saying? And when they do this, they just all those things that you mentioned as factors in the biopsychosocial, they just kind of throw them around a little bit, and they come up with different language, which they say is somehow better representative of all the things involved. And so I was witness to that a lot, and I was witness in the autistic movement to people, embracing things like self-diagnosis and community diagnosis, which I think can make a lot of sense for people who are having like impairment specific difficulties with this or that and are not getting leeway from institutions. It's reasonable for them to adopt a diagnosis in order to get accommodations, in order to make micro demands and get like accommodations from the institution. I have done that myself.
Mm-hmm.
But then to take that kind of compromising move you do for survival and to base your theoretical or social movement identity on it is on a whole other step, which I feel like a lot of activists, even as they critique, the medical model, are taking that secondary step where they're accepting the medical model while critiquing it. And so I think you're right that it goes into this vacuous, endless debate over causes and just coming up with new terminologies to resituate and resituate and resituate without recognizing that this debate over diagnosis is circular to begin with, and we need to start recognizing the material realities in the moment-to-moment issues that we're experiencing and how those connect to politics and how we can organize around those. So from that perspective, I think the Pasocrates stuff is brilliant. And I do see this need to reduce things to factors in the biopsychosocial model as really problematic. And it reminds me of, I've been very critical of the behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, and B.F. Skinner's B.F. Skinner, the behaviorists come up with this Skinner box that they see the person in, and they come up with all these factors as devices that are triggered or triggers, and what I've been hearing about the what's been happening in the UK, and you can give us more information about this, Flo, but in the UK they've been trying to abandon diagnosis and move toward this thing called formulation in the UK UK's recent changes to their mental health model. And that has been because the UK has been in this place which has been between the US behaviorist influence and the French and an Italian kind of anti-psychiatry stance. And then the UK is this battlefield, and so it'll be really important to hear Flo's opinion of this, because I think we're starting to hear a lot of trauma theory trotted out, which it's similar to what you're saying about the biopsychosocial, in that trauma theory it includes things like family or LGBT status, but it sees them as trauma triggers instead of recognizing that those are political issues that need to be acted upon instead of just parts of a diagnostic causal network.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're bringing something really important to the table. And while I say that, I will also say that I have been fond of biopsychosocial as a way of framing the necessity of some kind of epistemic pragmatism. I'm interested in people like William James. People who are seeking a pragmatism between this need to be naturalist in our understanding of psychiatric disability, and the need to be social determinist, and the need to be biodeterminist, and all these different competing philosophical requirements. That all those requirements are all polarizing and simplistic, and we do need something that unites all of those potential causes. But as soon as you unite them and you put the bio first, that necessitates a list, an implied set of priorities that center around the power of the clinician being maintained ultimately, and they also center around not seeing things like mental health as being a matter of politics, but they instead kind of atomize or individualize them. And on this podcast we use Giles Dove, who is this kind of this post-left left-com anarchist kind of figure who feels that capitalism kind of individuates us. And I think, of course, that process of individuation is echoed in the need to come up with ever more specific micro-diagnoses by the DSM, and then this endless need to generate endless new diagnoses and new words for new disorders is this need to endlessly kind of sequester and divide the human in order into profitable subsections almost, right?
Right.
So just on that, I that kind of leads on to a question I'd quite like to ask you about politics and political inclination and these things being pathologized. So, I guess just a great many of the writers that I really, really enjoy would probably be considered or even were accused of being quote unquote criminally insane. So I've always viewed, I guess it sounds a bit kooky, but I've always kind of viewed psychiatry as a tool,
Hmm.
to further alienate individuals, from perhaps their own political interests. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I noticed in the timeline there was a reference to psychiatric intervention being used in the USSR against dissidents and opponents.
Absolutely. But yeah, if it's okay, I want to make two quick comments about what Zara said as well before I make
Yeah.
a comment on that question. Well, I think, Zara, two things that I'm hearing from what you said, and I want to be really clear on the question of diagnosis, is that I'm not at all saying that we should abandon these critiques of diagnoses and even some of the alternative models that have been put forth, like the biopsychosocial and all of these things. I don't want to suggest that in any way, because I think what's a more useful way to think about these kinds of things as concrete interventions, like tools, strategies that can be taken up and used in particular moments. And in so many moments, they're going to be extremely useful for people to take back agency, to say, hey, you're not paying attention to such and such traumatic thing that happened to me, or this extremely difficult situation that I've gone through. These things, I think, appear because there's a demand or a desire for understanding of a broader situation. And so it's important to understand where they come from and also how they can be used by individuals. But then that brings us back to this material question of what is the actual archipelago of psychiatric institutions that exists in the United States. You have a number of community clinics that people just hop in and out of, and oftentimes just have a 15-minute consultation with a psychiatrist and get some drugs. You have a number of wards in psychiatric hospitals where people are picked up off the street or whatever situation and spend 72 hours in some shitty hospital ward. Or you have commitment centers across the country that look and feel quite a bit like just jails with sterile doctor's office inside of them. And you have forensic wards in prisons that are just, so-called psychiatric facilities in a literal prison. So that's sort of the archipelago of institutions that we have. You can introduce something, for instance, like trauma-informed therapy, but materially speaking, how is it going to be incorporated effectively into that archipelago? You might have a couple people who say, oh, wow, this is really exciting, and I want to try this because I recognize that a lot of the people in the institution that I'm in have experienced trauma in their life, but how is that actually going to look? And how is that actually going to materially change the situation of those people? If, for instance, you're saying we should bring trauma-informed therapy into a forensic ward of a prison, is that going to result in a real material improvement of those people's lives or psychological health? I personally don't think so. And you see, exactly, they're in prison. And you see a lot of really cynical literature coming out of prisons. There's a couple groups I can link to later. I don't have them right on hand right now, but there are these sort of nonprofit prison research groups of psychiatrists and psychologists who are using trauma-informed research and biopsychosocial approaches to talk about prisoners and understanding the prisoner. And the justification that they name in this work is not that this is going to result in a material improvement of the prisoners. Or, you might think, being a radical like us, that, oh, you recognize that such and such person wouldn't have committed a crime had they not gone through this horrific childhood experience or something like that. You would think that the logical conclusion would be, hey, get them out of this fucking place and put them somewhere better, put them back in the community or whatever language you might use. But no, their response instead is, wow, this literature, this way of understanding the patient is really going to help us control the ward on the prison.
Yeah.
This is really going to help us create a further understanding so we can calm these violent psychopaths down. So it's extremely cynical, and it doesn't, I think when these models are developed, they oftentimes, it feels like, okay, we found the model that's really going to solve these problems. And unfortunately, especially in the United States, what you see is this just absolute monster of the carceral archipelago just finds a way to swallow it and spit it back out in the most disgusting way possible. As for the question of psychiatry as a tool of political control, am I understanding the question right?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly fine way to frame it.
I would add a couple complicating folds there. It's true that there have been many people who have used psychiatry in a more or less conscious way to control deviant behavior or deviance. And the USSR has some good examples of that, of pathologizing homosexuality, pathologizing I can't remember exactly the terms that they use, but dissident behavior, and putting people in psychiatric prisons and using psychiatric so-called, quote unquote treatments to punish political prisoners, ECT, lobotomies, things like that. There was a big study in I believe it was the 70s. There were a number of Samizdat, underground publications that came out decrying the conditions of the Soviet institutions and talking about the kind of, this kind of naked form of social control, you might say, that was happening. But I happen to think that if psychiatry does have a social control function, that it's generally speaking much more subtle than that, that it's not, that the vast majority of psychiatrists don't believe that they are, the right hand of the bourgeoisie or something that is like, they don't see themselves like that. And I think that there's an interesting, important fold there, that if you want to talk about social control, you have to talk about then the ways that certain forms of normality have become inextricably intertwined with medical diagnoses and medical ways of thinking, which is, I think, quite a bit more complicated than just saying that it exists as this sort of like, some people talk about it as if it exists as a kind of like naked tool of political coercion and control. I don't think that's quite right. I think if it is an aspect of control, it's an ambient one. It's almost like an environmental one, rather than, it's not a gun. It's not a weapon like that. It can't be directed in such an instrumental way. And also the other complicating fold that comes in there is, while it does have a social control function, I do not think it can be reduced to the social control function. There's a really good book that people in the United States do not read very often. It was written by two French people, Robert and Francois Castel, and one American researcher named Anne Lovell, who were really involved with the radical psychiatric critiques of the 1970s around the world, not just in Europe. They also traveled to Brazil a number of times and the United States. And this group of three, they did a study of psychiatric institutions and psychiatric discourse in the United States over the course of a number of years. And they traveled mainly between Boston, New York, and San Francisco, I believe, doing this study. And I think they really show very well that the face of psychiatry at that time, and definitely now as well, is actually extraordinarily complex and contradictory even. That, for instance, the directives, the type of knowledge being produced and the practice that's going on from a lot of forensic psychiatrists, for example, who talk of psychopathy, and they talk about, where the name of my project comes from, of unsound mind. That's a legal concept, non compos mentis, and it's supposed to be, it's connected to the very famous not guilty by reason of insanity charge. So their whole discourse and their practice is completely different. The way they come to conclusions, the way they organize knowledge, the way that they act in the world is 100% completely different from, for instance, a university psychiatry researcher who works in a university clinic and is operating with much more precise tools and terminology, and with completely different kind of power of arranging a body, of coming to a decision. And they, in turn, are operating completely different from the psychiatrist who works in the hospital ward, who oftentimes works almost like, running back and forth between different wards, observing people for extremely brief periods of times and making a psychiatric determination based off of a mere couple of hours or even just minutes with a person.
I'm sorry, what was the name of this book that this is all from?
The book is called The Psychiatric Society.
Awesome. I want to read that. That's a great recommendation.
Yes,
I appreciate it.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. And yeah, what it really shows to me, I think, is that what we're dealing with when we talk about the question of psychiatry is we're not dealing with psychiatry, capital P. We're dealing with an umbrella term that's used to cover an extraordinarily broad range of practices, of discourses, of ways of organizing knowledge in space, architecture. So, sometimes people talk about psychiatry as if it's sort of unified in its aims and discussion. I don't think so. I think we're dealing with a contradictory field, a field that contains its own contradictions within itself. Its directives for healing, but also its carceral aspect. Its drive for understanding the person mixed with its reducing the person to really simple diagnosis. All of these things exist at once and in one place. So when you think about where can political activity intervene into this force, I often think about we need less of this idea that we need a really robust oppositional force that's going to face psychiatry and take it down or something from the outside. And sometimes more of like, we need to find the contradictions and rend them open and have it sort of break down into these components where we can find new possibilities and also weaken the power of the carceral and policing aspects. As to what that means specifically, it gets a bit more complicated, but that's sort of the general orientation that I bring into thinking about these questions.
Wow, thanks. That's a really good answer.
That was a really good response. If I may start to discuss more about the praxis angle, I think that's a really important point to bring up. During my research, which is not, it's complete, but I'm not done working with it with the grant paperwork. I had the chance to interview some people who I can give you the names of later, who were organizing a patient-run drop-in center in Washington, D.C. And that sounds a lot very similar to your Hearing Voices network. These organizations that are coming together, are not in many cases run by the nonprofit industrial complex. Not originally. I mean, many of them go through processes of being digested by the systemic forces. But I'm just wondering, Sasha, how does we know that there's a bunch of nonprofits that exist in the psychiatric disability world, and there's also informal organizations. Where do groups of patients who are organizing themselves fit into this archipelago that you're mapping out for us?
That's one of the essential questions, that I'm still thinking about all the time and trying to figure out and map, because again, I think any kind of simple answer has to be avoided here, because you can absolutely find people, for instance, in NAMI, of psychiatric patients and survivors who, very willingly uplift or support positions that I have really no interest in. So, merely being a psychiatric survivor or a psychiatric patient or former patient certainly does not inscribe you into any kind of particular politic at all. And I know that that's the case for any of these categories, But as for groups that are explicitly organizing themselves around creating new social spaces or even taking a more explicit political position, it really depends on a number of factors. The group that I'm a part of, I'm really proud of the space that we've created, and really happy with the kinds of discussions that we have every week. We meet once a week, basically. It's been strongly affected by the pandemic, and unfortunately, we often have to meet online at this point. But we usually, in the past, we met in person. And it's like kind of a drop-in thing. Anyone can come in, and we go over our principles at the beginning. A lot of them are like, this is a non-pathologizing space. You can talk about your experience however you want. You can explore experiences that perhaps would get you in trouble in other places. I don't know how many people know this, but if you go into the doctor's office and you talk about you've been feeling like you've been imagining killing yourself or something, that could get you in a lot of trouble in a normal situation. Or you've been talking about hearing voices, say, to give a kind of abstract, fantastical example, maybe, someone in your family just died and you talk about, I've been hearing their voice and they've been talking to me, something like that. That particular situation could get somebody in trouble depending on the reaction of the doctor, the discretion that they use. So we create a space where people can talk about those kind of things openly. And also, I think even more importantly than that, rather than just being a release valve for people, is it creates an alternative system of social supports where people know now you have a number of contacts of people who you can get in contact with if you're going through something really extreme, like a crisis or something. And you can get in contact and that group is going to have a more mellowed response. They're not going to freak out just because you're saying you're hearing a voice or you're seeing something maybe other people aren't seeing or something like that. And, people know we're not going to call the cops. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to offer whatever support that we can in that moment. So I'm really proud of what we've been able to do by building that, and also, going into these spaces and having conversations with both workers and with patients. But there's serious limitations to what we can accomplish as a social group in the conditions that we're facing right now, especially with the pandemic. But even normally, we oftentimes can't really get past, just because of the organizational form, we can't really get past that level of making connections one by one, bringing people over into this different kind of social world, allowing people to have a release valve, offering social supports. That stuff is all amazing and good, but I think we're very much aware of the serious limitations that are involved with that. That being said, within certain moments of historical crisis and breakdown or transformation, I think new opportunities are opened. And a really good example of that is the way that I've been reading about how HVN, Hearing Voices Network groups, have operated under conditions of austerity and radical politics in Greece, where there's, a pretty broad anarchist and left movement there that people, I think, most of your listeners are probably very much aware of. But there's a book that came out from Common Notions not too long ago that talks about this, called For Health Autonomy. And they talk about factory occupations. They talk about health collectives that arose in conditions of austerity when the state was kind of, not providing very robust services for people. And the HVN groups, this is the thing that piqued my interest, is the HVN groups in that time were able to step in and take a broader role. For instance, in a factory occupation, the HVN group was able to come in, talk about this different way of approaching psychic problems, you might say, what is perceived as a psychic problem, different approaches that are much more social in nature. And they were able to have a strong influence on the way that psychic health and behavioral differences were approached in that factory occupation. So I guess what I'm saying with that is we should always be more faithful to the struggle than to any particular model. And the model, if there is a model, it needs to serve, the struggle. We want to find ways to intervene and to grow our power with other people at those particular moments when those openings arise, right? So I think the HVN model is an interesting model because it is quite open. Like it's organized around these ideas of offering social space and being open to different perspectives and all these things. That could go in a lot of directions. You could absolutely see that going in a kind of direction where it's static and it just stays in the one place and you just meet with people. But what the example from Greece, I think, shows is that given the opportunity and the willingness to jump into a struggle, it can transform itself and become a groundwork to change the way that people approach something like psychic suffering in the midst of a struggle. So those are the kinds of things I keep my eyes open for, and keep in mind when it feels like we're in a lull in the struggle, when there's nothing much going on, and especially during the pandemic when we all feel kind of trapped in our houses and stuff. Nevertheless, I still think that it could change at any moment, and the opening would arise. And in that moment, we're going to be much better off if we have this group of people who have been meeting now for years to explicitly and continuously challenge something like psychiatric diagnoses and the way that they're treated in the contemporary world. So I guess that's what I think about.
That was great. That sounds wonderful. I think all of your examples are really good of hearing voices being a thing that can that avoids those pitfalls. And I think your description of the organizing reminds me of a lot of the experiences that people like myself and Flo might have with other types of organizations, like the experiences I have when I organized unions with the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and Flo also has some of those experiences, as well as experiences of the democratic process that you would experience on the gay pagan communes that I participated in the group called the Radical Fairies. Again, those groups both have a very direct democratic formation to their space creation. And those groups have not been sort of co-opted by any bigger machine. I think that the unions at one point tried to co-opt IWW and weren't successful in the United States. But a lot of groups who organize drop-in centers or things like Hearing Voices are then taken over by nonprofits once they get to a certain level of success. Are you concerned about that happening, Sasha, with Hearing Voices Network?
Not, at least not our. The Hearing Voices Network actually has for specific lines, principles that people abide by in order to remain a Hearing Voices group. And as far as I know, I haven't looked at them in a bit, but I don't think that you can become a nonprofit or anything like that and still actually remain the same group. So I'd have to look back into that because I can't actually remember. The principles that always stick out to me, the one that I always remember is that you can't be an official Hearing Voices group and be embedded within, like, for instance, a psychiatric ward or something like that. But that's
great. I love that. Keep going.
Oh yeah, yeah. You can't be a Hearing Voices group, an official one, if you're on a psychiatric ward or in a prison or something like that. You can do something that's called like an affiliated thing, where it's an affiliated group where you're sort of using similar principles, but by definition, it's technically not a Hearing Voices group because the Hearing Voices model is about creating non-clinical social spaces. So if it's in a clinical space, it's kind of contradictory there, not entirely possible. But as for co-optation from nonprofits and all of that, I mean, yeah, it's a constant danger. It's a constant danger because the nonprofit industrial complex is a really good way to take the language of the language that's being developed by radical currents in and against psychiatry and disability services and everything. And it has a really fantastic way of kind of extending them into the infinite without really I want to be careful about what I'm saying, so I'm thinking we want to be careful not to develop something where it's creating a kind of actually, let me rephrase all this. I'm sorry. Maybe you can cut some of this out. But I think there's two different ways, two different problems, I think, within the nonprofit field that are like serious dangers for a radical mental health practice. The first is that they often position themselves as a sort of advocacy group, right? Like we're trying to increase the visibility or increase the um, kind of conversation that we're having around, for instance, psychiatric psychosocial disability or something like that. The central problem of the advocate that goes back just to the definition of an advocate is that they're all about increasing visibility and increasing conversation, but nevertheless, the only way they can do that is by speaking for someone. So it's still this stand-in where the nonprofit or the person who's embodying the nonprofit is standing in for the person that they're actually talking about. So it's kind of a contradiction that already exists within the field. But let's say there's a nonprofit that's made up entirely of psychiatric survivors or something like that. I think the first problem that you run into obviously is the money problem of if your organization is organized around opposing a certain kind of coercive psychiatric treatment or something like that. It should be theoretically fighting to abolish itself at all times. But that's not exactly how they operate. They often operate in this kind of like self-serving way of just putting out, infographics or informational pamphlets or something that don't have any teeth. And I'm not saying that there's a kind of intentionality behind that, but you do have to wonder what exactly is the radical strategy of an organization who only exists to oppose some sort of treatment or some model or something like that. It seems like there's some serious limitations as to what they could be capable of, and also how far they're willing to go with that, right?
Right. That's a really important point that I think gets lost on a lot of disability rights organizations. Is that they should be fighting to abolish themselves and cede power to the individual people who are dealing with that kind of disability oppression. I agree.
I would just say what you've described doesn't sound actually like your project. Doesn't sound too dissimilar from how I'd envisage a kind of post-capitalist organization of psychiatric care, I suppose. In that it sounds like you're actually engage. I feel like just kind of relating to what you were talking about in regards to advocacy. I feel like those relationships can be quite alienating, or like almost compound the alienation that I think oftentimes exacerbates or causes distress. So it's just really fascinating to me because I hadn't even heard of kind of groups of people coming together and creating such an open space for people just to express themselves without a lot of the, I suppose, kind of moralisms that or the danger of being kind of screwed over by maybe one doctor who goes too far. It's really interesting to me.
Right. And on the connecting both the idea of this group and to what Zara was saying, maybe closer to the point of what really I think is dangerous about the nonprofitization of groups is that they have to function with a certain kind of understanding of specific categories. Those might not be medical or diagnostic categories, but they might be something like we are a group for such and such group, like psychiatrized people or psychiatric survivors or something like that. Those categories, to me, the usefulness of those categories and those positions is to as a source of power to problematize the field and to problematize the questions that we're facing with. And that's why I favor these groups like the Hearing Voices group, where the only thing that we're sort of agreeing to is to come together and discuss things in a conflictual way, in a open way, in a questioning way. These are all sorts of like core principles that we bring to the table. So the way that the space is organized and the conversation is organized is all about opening up the room, opening up the space to problematization of putting things in questions, putting things in brackets, suspending our judgment about things. Again, I want to return back to the Italian example, just because I think that they're not very well known in the Anglophone world, and I'm really inspired by the Italian movement. And they had a number of open assemblies at the institutions that they were in. And the point of the open assemblies was not to come to conclusions or to establish any kind of directed behavior or directed end as a group, but was actually to open the space to disagreements, to even incoherent forms of speech or non-forms of speech, non-verbal forms of speech. It's opening the room to the problems that already exist. It's introducing conflict and contradiction into the space, where what we're embodying and inhabiting together in the space is the open contradictions that surround us. That's the situation that I want to cultivate and continue to bring forward, because I feel like it's within those contradictions, or maybe you could say out of those contradictions, one, that we recognize our own power, and also, two, that we see openings where we can challenge, disrupt, or even destroy the forms of violence that we're faced with in these fields. And the nonprofits, what they end up doing, in my opinion, is, again, flattening things to this level where they can be understood categorically or quantitatively, often for really material reasons. They need to be able to quantify their findings so that they can continue to get funding, or so that they can find more partners in coalitions and things. So they're almost oftentimes directed not towards problematizing situations and opening up contradictions, but the exact opposite. They're smoothing out social interactions. They're putting them into categories. They're quantifying them. They're doing studies on them. They're turning them into sources of revenue and funding. That is the wrong direction, I think. We need to, and this is not going to happen from a nonprofit, because a nonprofit is never going to be able to find a way to sustain itself on the basis of contradictions. So it's just a dead end. It's part of the kind of, rationalizing the problems that exist, turning them into policy decisions or something like that. Not saying that those struggles are always completely not worth engaging in. I'm not saying that at all. There are concrete times and places where, such and such specific thing should change, like lobotomies, for example. We don't want lobotomies. But we need to be very wary and careful of rationalizing these things, turning them into simple, discrete categories that can be quantified and turned into these streams of revenue, because then we're really oversimplifying the situation, and we're also smoothing over potential sources of social conflict.
All of that is so brilliant. You put things in such a clear way. And all of this, it feels very relevant to the egoist anarchist standpoint that where there's all these notions of the individual that our society is trying to craft, and those are all ultimately inhibiting what Stirner would call our creative nothing, our our uniqueness. And maybe we can. Flo, do you have anything, any kind of egoist linkages to this effort that Sasha is making to make space for kind of free experiential kind of unity or sharing or space opening?
Well, I think that's actually why I find an opening. How did you describe it? A space where you could actually discuss the contradictions and conflicts as they actually are in that moment. I find that absolutely fascinating, and I've never ever heard of a project or a group of people try and do that before. I think one of my, kind of based on my questions earlier on diagnostics and stuff, is one of my, I guess, biggest pet peeves with, and maybe I'm viewing psychiatry when I ask these questions in a kind of monolithic way, is that it does it. I don't know. I'm always thinking of a toad on kind of being. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit I feel like oftentimes the people who are quote unquote ill are treated as subjects to be theorized over, and it's just absolutely fantastic in my view that you're creating a space where people can actually express themselves as they are without fear of retribution or, further pathologization.
And on that note, I think what you said in relation to the question about politics, about normality being something which is ultimately enforcing political normality, is enforced in part by psychiatric normality, which has been taught to everyone and has been, kind of put inside of our families and put inside of our schools and put inside of all of our institutions. I think that's so wise, and I do think that psychiatry has played a role with the Cold War on probably both sides of the Atlantic, where these nations with a certain political normality use psychiatric normality to uphold their political normality, and that goes even much further than beyond, putting someone like a gay poet, in an asylum or something like that during the Cold War. But it also goes into, putting people who are political dissidents into mental health care, or even my own recent diagnosis, called me a depressive for expressing anarchist ideas to the therapist, So
Right.
so I think that you're right that, like, mental health normality, it feeds political normality, and it builds this tendency to reduce people to these simplistic individualisms, instead of embracing that everyone is this endless streaming, source of creative, dynamism, which is what, the egoist critique would suggest, or what the communist hopes for when the communist hopes to abolish, class divisions, is to return workers to their base, to their passions, instead of being like one of these produced subjects, right?
Yeah, and to return back to this question of psychiatry and normality and political normality, I want to introduce a couple complicating folds into this question too, because it's without a doubt it has been used as a tool of normalization and pathologization of deviant or radical behavior. There's no question that that's true. A really famous example that it has sort of been at least in the alternative psychiatry world, just like front and center for many years now, is Jonathan Metzl's The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease. And that was about, just to really briefly recap it, because everybody talks about this book now, in the 1960s during the civil rights movement, how schizophrenia was mostly thought of prior to that as a disease for docile white women who were alienated from their marriages. And in the 1960s, the diagnostic criteria, they basically just added a couple words that, I shouldn't say basically, it's more complicated than that, but the diagnosis was transformed to include more language around aggression and violence. And suddenly the rate at which Black men were being hospitalized for schizophrenia just rose dramatically. And the demographic completely shifted. So that's an example where you can see a certain kind of political expression, and it's specifically embodied in a racial group, a Black group, was pathologized and turned and kind of mixed with a disease category. However, we have to introduce a couple complicating folds there, that psychiatry can also operate in the other direction, in the sense that, for instance, you look at the January 6th Capitol riot, or whatever you want to call it. A lot of people have been calling for, a lot of left liberals and left people have been saying that these people are psychotic, that they are, there's something like mentally wrong with them. You hear this all the time too when there's a right wing mass shooter, and you hear a lot of language and discourse around them being insane or mentally ill in some capacity. That kind of psychiatry, that form of pathologization, is actually working in the opposite direction. It's not serving as a tool to defend the ruling class, or however you want to just talk about that. It's being used as a way to depoliticize the situation, to empty it out of political content and place it back on the individual, their upbringing, whether it's a social form of alienation or it's a medical one. It doesn't really matter. The point is to displace the political question that gave birth to this, this insurgent right-wing movement. So psychiatry can operate in a number of different ways to bolster or support the sort of social control function. And then at the same time, there are also individuals out there who find that psychiatry has offered them a sort of outlet to express an abnormal or non-normative behavior or experience, and it's offered them a language and a way for them to talk about it. So that's something that a lot of the radicals, especially the super anti-psychiatry, psychiatry is a complete fraud, sham, there's nothing in it, people run up against, is like, you talk to people who say, this is the only way I know how to talk about my experience. This is like, and this has offered me an outlet to discuss something that's very important and a vital aspect of my personality or my history or something like that. So you run into these folds and these complications that make it really difficult to freeze psychiatry as a tool of
one or other.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That it's actually a kind of a problematic field, I would say. There's these folds and these complications that make it really difficult to make large pronouncements. And also, I want to just kind of address, at least for me, this sort of elephant in the room here when we're talking about these questions, and that's Thomas Szasz. And I don't know how familiar other of you are with Thomas Szasz, but he was a Hungarian Jewish refugee from who left Eastern Europe and came to the United States. And he was a psychiatrist, but he's probably, in the Anglophone world, I would say he is the most recognizable and used figure of anti-psychiatry. I don't think that that's a controversial statement to make. He wrote a book in 1961, I believe, called The Myth of Mental Illness. And this book and the books that he wrote following it have probably colored the way that US people, but also lots of British people and other English-speaking people especially, have developed a language and developed a kind of discourse around anti-psychiatry. And he's probably the main reason that I really hesitate to call myself anti-psychiatry living in the United States. I really think that he's contributed in a number of negative ways to the discourse around these topics. To give a brief summary, his position is along the lines of mental illness is not a concrete lesion, and it's not a disease in the same way that other diseases are diseases. So it's actually a myth, or it's a metaphor for disease that we're using to describe what is actually a problem of behavior or a problem of society or something like that. Some of those things sound fine, well and good. And that's why I think it's the simplicity of his argument, and also the kind of, he was a very witty person and he was very caustic in his relationship to psychiatry. And I think that's very appealing to a lot of people. But when you start to actually break down what he's talking about and his solutions or his ideas, I think they're pretty abysmal. He was politically right-wing. He was a conservative libertarian. And when he talks about what we're doing is pathologizing problems of society or political problems, and we're just turning them into mental illnesses, his solution is not, his idea is not that we shouldn't be problematizing these behaviors or pathologizing them or criminalizing them or any of these things at all, or have any kind of social control. He's saying that the social control function should be limited to the military and the police. He's very much not an anti-authoritarian figure or a hero of the radical left or anything like that. He's a classic libertarian who doesn't want. He thinks that the power of psychiatry being involved with its policing function, which it literally has, it does have a policing function inscribed in the law. That's not a metaphor. But his problem with the psychiatric policing function is not a problem with the policing function. It's just a problem with the psychiatric part, right? Mm. He's wants the police, he wants the prisons and everything else. He just doesn't want it to be this nebulous power that has so much discretion that it can define its own categories. I think he's extremely mistaken on that on a number of points. One is that the police power itself is entirely discretionary. We have laws and things that you're not supposed to transgress, But the police, on a day-to-day basis, have discretionary power to define what is disorderly conduct, what is something that they are going to intervene in or not. So you don't get rid of the problem of discretion by just removing the psychiatric from psychiatric police. And then also this form of analogy that he uses for his critique, that psychiatry is not a medical profession because it doesn't have a concrete lesion, doesn't even stand up to a kind of medical critique. What it ends up doing is you have a lot of anti-psychiatry people who are saying, psychiatry is not real science and it should be abolished because it's not truly medical in the way that the medical professions are. Suddenly you have a lot of people who are ostensibly radical critics of the medical establishment going to bat for the health system, which is abysmal and terrible and has its own problems, right? It's the medical professions are not they're not more they're not more stable, more authoritative than psychiatry, in my opinion. They should be critiqued in the exact same way. They should be opened up to these radical critiques and practices in the same way that psychiatry should. And I find that Zaz opens the door to this medical apologism, right? This of saying that psychiatry is specifically the problematic form of medicine, and the other ones, comparatively, are solid, legit, real, scientific, all of these things. And then on top of all of that, practically speaking, he made an alliance with the Church of Scientology, because the Scientology, I don't think it's that surprising why Scientology would want to get involved in this. I see it just purely as a kind of competition, right? They want the same people that psychiatry is going for, specifically the people who are in distress and looking for answers and looking for a discourse that's going to help them explain things or come to terms with their experience. They're competing for that same body of people.
Demographic, yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. So to me, it's no surprise that Scientology wants to get involved in this game, but Zaz making an agreement with them and arranging himself with them, and then they're after that becoming sort of the figurehead of anti-psychiatry in the US. In my opinion, it's been a disaster for social movements in the US, for movements that are oriented in a radical way of reimagining, rethinking, or opposing certain psychiatric discourses and practices. The infatuation and connection with Zaz has been really problematic. That's not to say that he hasn't opened the door for a ton of people. He's oftentimes people's major entry point into thinking about these problems. And some of his writing is brilliant, especially his writing on forensic psychiatry and the connection between psychiatry and law. He's very smart in that way. But he also he has a very rigid position, a very oppositionally rigid position that imagines two poles. There's the kind of, him as the smart libertarian freedom, but, this particular American kind of American revolutionary kind of freedom of give me my property, my money, my military and my police, and then leave me the fuck alone kind of thing. I just think it's been incredibly problematic. And on top of all that, too, he's really fond of making historical analogies between different systems and ways of thinking. American anti-psychiatry and critical psychiatry has a serious race problem. And I think Zaz has contributed to that enormously as well, because he's many times used the analogy of comparing psychiatry to plantation slavery. And that is just absurd and wrong. And it makes no sense beyond this kind of extremely abstract level of thinking. Anytime people are being controlled by someone else can be analogized with slavery, which is just, terrible and ridiculous. Yeah, the specificity, the complexity of the situation is lost when we start kind of engaging in those kinds. Yeah, exactly.
It's the opposite of almost, earlier on we were talking about psychiatry in certain cases obfuscating the political landscape. That kind of does the polar opposite in the same way.
Exactly. Right. You see an anti-psychiatry in that case obfuscating and oversimplifying, flattening something with enormous political dimensions and contemporary relevancy that's just being subsumed into this question of psychiatry, and it does not belong there. Right.
That was fascinating. I'm really enjoying listening to you talk. These are really erudite answers. Probably never actually had a conversation like this before.
Yes,
Well, that's
I was brought into antipsychiatry from people more like R.D. Laing or David Cooper, who come from a phenomenological standpoint,
hmm
and that's where I find my place. I didn't even know that Basaglia used Husserl, but I love Husserl myself independently. And I think what you're saying about Zaz is very important, and I think Zaz influenced my thinking at a certain point in my life, but then I forgot about him. I tried to avoid thinking about him ever again. And I think of antipsychiatry as more a phenomenological thing, and that's why I find myself using it and telling people that I'm part of it, because I don't, I think of it as along the lines of R.D. Laing's, repeated phenomenological interventions,
hmm
R.D. Laing is someone who is operating, of course, once more in the UK, just like Flo, and R.D. Laing was someone who was, I think, much less controversial. And I think R.D. Laing, his problems were more about, he was so frustrated with psychiatry, and then he thought that hallucinogens were this perfect, alternative to it, and that wasn't
hmm
really the case either. I don't think hallucinogens are a perfect alternative to psychiatry. I think hallucinogens can be just as dangerous if misused as a psychiatric drug could be. Again,
100%.
I don't think the problem with psychiatry is anything like it being, less, I don't agree with Zaz about any of it, but I think the problem with psychiatry is that it has a medical component, but it also takes on a role where it has a certain authoritarian function, in so many ways, and it decides what thoughts are okay, and it projects those decisions into every professional, from a teacher to a preschool teacher, to a tutor, to every possible role gets populated with psychiatric, ideas about normalcy. And so, again, I don't see myself at all close to Zaz, and I don't see myself as, some sort of someone who thinks that acid is a cure all,
hmm
like Lang did either. But I do see these co-created spaces, like the industrial workers, like these radical movements, including, Hearing Voices Network, as a kind of answer, which is not clinical, which is just people being able to freely share their experiences, and I think that's really hopeful. Flo, do you have any last questions, or anything to add?
Uh, I'm not sure I do actually. I found that last bit really fascinating because I haven't read any of these writers before, but I can almost see definitely at one point I probably would have found myself actually in the camp that you've just described of just basically being like, oh, it's all bullshit. Um, so I found that fascinating actually. I found this entire discussion really interesting. Um, but no, I'm not sure I'd have anything to add to that. Yeah.
If I could, I just want to add a quick. Can I respond to what you said, Zara?
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah, I have to go in just a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to say that on the notion of maybe I'm insisting on this point over and over again, the idea of sort of like maybe a plural approach to things, but um, I know and understand also that people use the term. I was just critiquing anti-psychiatry, and the Zazian form of anti-psychiatry at least. But that's not to say that I don't that there's not a ton of amazing stuff that goes under the name, and it's the same. It's just the same thing of like, how do you understand that name? I think that it comes down to, if you imagine anti-psychiatry as a sort of static polarized position on the opposite end of psychiatry, that's where I can't really figure out how to make sense of that, or that doesn't really feel like a tenable position to me. But the form of anti-psychiatry that you're discussing from the phenomenological tradition, I think The Divide itself is one of the best phenomenological accounts of madness ever written. It's so good. That uh, that the anti there, what is the work of the anti doing in that word, right? It's not opposing itself as a kind of fixed alternative model that you can just glob onto, or that's a political form that's going to be um, opposed to psychiatry in a polarized way, but the anti is just doing the work of breaking down those notions, breaking down those concepts, of opening them up to different ideas, opening up to different forms of approach, methods of approach. And in that sense, as a form of concrete contradiction and negation that exists, that is a kind of anti-psychiatry that I think is opening doors in the way that I was talking about earlier. And also, just to remark on the point that you brought up, Zara, about the psychiatrization that is extending outwards. I think the US is really the prime example of this trend of the psychiatrization of society. Everything is becoming psychiatrized, where the dividing line is no longer between the raving madman and the normal guy, but it's between these increasingly intricate and minute levels of deviancy that can be approached with increasingly specific and minute therapeutic approaches. This is a serious danger that we're facing. And I have a personal example, I think that's pretty extreme, because you mentioned teachers. I am by profession a preschool teacher, though the preschool I've been working at has not been operating during the pandemic. But so I've been a babysitter lately, but I'm a preschool teacher usually. And we did a training, I want to say like 3 years ago now, and they brought in this professional. And I'm not joking you, the professional gave us the psychological professional gave us a presentation on how to spot the signs of mental illness in kids as young as 2 years old. 2 years old. They were giving us these basically checklists. This is often how modern psychiatry functions, especially in its more time-constrained form, is just like checking off boxes on a list. And if you get enough boxes for a certain amount of time, then you've achieved the correct diagnosis or whatever. But yeah, this was absolutely wild to me that we're supposed to be confronting a group of 2-year-olds who can barely speak, for the most part, if they are speaking people, or and we're supposed to be on the lookout for certain phrases or ways of carrying yourself or behavior when they haven't figured out how to behave at all as human beings, right? They don't, they're growing, they're trying to figure it out. And we're supposed to already be on the lookout for these signs of deviance. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And I know that that's not an isolated example, that there are these trends in specifically US psychiatry, but all over the world. I just think we're the most advanced place of finding and securing those lines of deviance at younger and more subtle stages in development. So very dangerous development.
Absolutely. Well, it's been amazing to talk to you. There was someone that wanted to talk to you, one of our collective members, Violet. I hope you'll come talk to us a second time, talk with Violet. But I've loved hearing from you. I think we've done a lovely job of sketching out places for psychiatric patient worker autonomy in the form of Hearing Voices Network, and we've also done a lovely job of sketching out the class complexities of trying to battle the repressive aspects of psychiatry in broader society. So I think we've had an amazing conversation already, and I would love to talk more about the potentials of using trade unions in this work and many other questions. But I know that you have to head over to work. So please have an excellent day at work, Sasha. And let's talk again soon. And once more, this has been an episode of Facing Autonomy, and we've had a wonderful discussion of the struggle for mental health patient autonomy.
Thank you so much, Zara, and it was nice to meet you, Flo. I look forward to the next time.
Thank you so much. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.